Welcome back to the Not Your Mama podcast. This is your host, Kelly Bryant, and I'm joined today by Lindsay Perez. Hey, Lindsay.
Hello.
Lindsay, tell us your pronouns and what emoji you most identify with.
My pronouns are she, her, and I most identify with the cheeseburger emoji.
Oh, shit. I did not see that coming. Wow.
Yeah. I just love it so much. Anytime I need an emoji to identify food, that's what I go to. I just love a good cheeseburger. It's like comfort, you know?
No, this is like not something I identify. Like, I don't like meat doesn't do it for me. So like,
Well, I should say I don't really eat meat either. For the most part, I'm a pescatarian. I try to be as much as possible, but to me, that is like a luxury. That's like the one thing that I'll break it for is a cheeseburger. I was between that and like the dancing girl in the red dress. I don't know what we call her.
me. Yeah, salsa
Yeah.
lady. That's me
Salsa
for
lady.
sure.
Yeah.
That's how I express excitement. Like some people do the praise hands. I'm like, woo, we're gonna salsa dance.
We're gonna dance. Yeah, I like it.
So Lindsay is not just here because she's my friend, although Lindsay is I thought about it earlier. I was like, shit, we've known each other like over a decade.
Yeah.
That's a long time. But
long time.
Lindsay is a financial coach and I'm super excited. She's like all about like strong women and shit. So I feel like this is like a great perspective, right? Because I don't want everyone to like hit stop when they hear like financial coach and think like, ew, this is kind of boring. Like Lindsay is going to make this super engaging and she's like very much going to tie it into women's empowerment and all the things. So give us like the quick version of your professional background, what you do, how you got there.
Yeah. So I like to describe myself as like money expert, finance nerd, empowerment guru. I have worked in TV news. I have worked on Wall Street and I've worked as a financial coach. So I've kind of done all the things. I've worked at a tech company too. So I guess the summation of my professional life is just I've worn a lot of hats and I've sort of had this little Goldilocks journey where each time I make a new choice, I'm trying to get closer and closer to being like 100% fulfilled by whatever I'm doing.
Amazing. And I feel like a fun fact about you is when you say like you worked in TV news, like you are one of the like unicorns who is an NBC page. Are we allowed to say that? That's like not a secret, right?
Yeah, no, that's not a secret at
all.
It's
not like a cult that they're like now they're gonna kill you.
No, definitely not. It's funny because I feel like if you know what that means, people think it's very cool. Or the alternative is like people have never heard that term before and they're just like, oh,
I mean, if they've seen 30 Rock, I feel like 30 Rock like made like the idea of like being a page, like people like know what that is now.
That's true. Yeah. Usually I can point to that or like bring up that show and I'll be like, yeah, like I was Kenneth. I like ran around in a little suit and funny like sidebar about me when I was a page, that show was already out and sometimes if I got sent on like an urgent errand I would hum the theme song to myself as I ran through like Rockefeller Center. I would just be like bum 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 and it would like get me going and I would run around. But yeah, it was a very cool time. We can definitely talk about that.
So I mean, I think one of the things that like you touched on this of, you know, your personal journey of like kind of moving closer and closer to like finding a career and also a job, which are kind of two different things, that is actually fulfilling. And for the people who you work with, like money is one part of fulfillment. Like how, when you talk to people about, you know, their finances and kind of aligning, I'm going to say like some woo woo words, like aligning their financial values with their like idea of what they want in life, you know, meaning, purpose, whatever. Like, what are some of the things that come up aside from just like dollar bills?
Yeah. I mean, time is a big one, right? You don't have to work more or harder to make more money, but a lot of high paying jobs are tied to, you know, a longer work week. So the question is like, what is the balance? Where's the meeting point between how much you want to work and how much you want to make, right? Like where do those two ideals kind of touch on each other? So, and then I think part of it too is kind of, I mean, this is dollar bills, but like, how much do you need to live the life you want? Most people don't know the answer to that question, right? You just kind of say like, what do you want to make?
Right.
Or, you know, the common thing now is like, what are you worth? And it's sort of like, well, how does one even start to answer that
Yeah,
question?
you're a fucking human being. So like it's a
Right.
little difficult to be like, what are you worth? Like that actually
Worth.
really pisses me off. I'm like, no, your worth has nothing to do with how much money you are capable of making.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, as you're
Yeah.
saying, like there's a difference between like how much money you're capable of making and how
Mm-hmm.
much money you like need to make in order to have the life that you want,
Right.
and how much money like your current position is capable of making, like what, you know, the
Mm-hmm.
cap or whatever on like the field that you're in.
Right. Yeah.
And then of course when we're talking about people who you know, bear children, folks with a womb, then the question of parenthood comes into it, right? So in
Right.
general, for like a non-carrying parent, there's like much more flexibility and
Mm-hmm.
fluidity around like, yeah, you can just like you can wait till you're loaded and then you can have kids. But
Right.
you know, for people who have a biological clock, it's like, okay, so I have like this amount of money that I want to make, and I have this amount of time that I'm willing to spend at work. And also I have a deadline for like when I have to take some amount of time off, like potentially give up my job,
Mm-hmm.
potentially just take time off. Like, and I mean, I'm assuming that you like know statistics and things. I don't know if you know these offhand, but like that has a pretty significant impact on your lifelong earning potential to like
Mm-hmm.
take time off, even just a maternity leave or parental leave to take time off to work. So, I mean, do you talk to a lot of people who are in this position of like, I know I want to have kids, like, like making that work financially?
Yes, and the more common conversation is like, I am having a kid or I have
Mm-hmm.
kids,
Mm-hmm.
and now what? Right? I think our generation has started to shift our mentality about children as a choice. And I
Mm-hmm.
don't mean that to say that like people shouldn't be having children. I just mean that to say like we are planning for it more. We
Mm-hmm.
think about it less as something that happens to us
Mm-hmm.
and more as something that we want to do or choose to do.
Mm.
And that what comes with that is more planning financially for that decision. Um, so yes, like we do see people who are trying to kind of figure out when is the right time for me, like financially. I think with kids, it's like anything else that you want to do, it's about choices,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, you know, a child is an expensive thing, or it can be, right? Like we'll talk about some of the resources that I recommend to people for kind of trying to calculate what the cost of having a child is.
Oh my God.
Um,
I genuinely don't want to know.
Well, and the thing is, it depends, right? Like, where do you live? How
Mm-hmm.
much childcare do you need?
Right.
What kinds of, you know, what kind of life do you and that baby want to have, right?
Yeah.
So, like,
And I mean,
are
it
you,
starts at prenatal care, even. Like,
yeah,
I
absolutely.
paid out of pocket for a home birth, and like, it was very reassuring to be like, that has a price tag. Like, it was $6,000,
Hmm.
period. But if I'd been transferred to a hospital, like, who knows? Like the
Right.
just prenatal care, birth, and then of course people get into postpartum and like, oh shit, they have to go to a pelvic floor PT twice a week for 6 weeks at $60. It's like,
Yeah. And you know, the key is really just kind of knowing what you're getting yourself into as much as you
mhm,
can, right? And so one of my number one recommendations to people who are, you know, pregnant or planning on having a child is call your insurance company, assuming that you're covered, and understand what they will pay for and what they won't pay for.
mhm.
Because as with anything, it's not that spending money is bad, but you want to be as prepared as possible for what that price tag is going to look like. And then you
Right.
can make a plan and it's fine, but you don't want to be surprised when it happens. That's much more stressful.
Yes, it is. And it's like for sure is like a whole brain thing that's like happening in labor. that like, you're like, oh my God, I can't afford. I mean, this is more so for people. I did not have insurance when I had my daughter, which was terrifying to be like, no, this is like bankrupting. Like if you don't have medical insurance when you have a kid. So that is like thing one. And like I mean, I was about to say the best insurance policy is an insurance policy, but like,
right.
if you don't have one of those, the best insurance policy is like to actually prepare for a normal vaginal birth so that you aren't getting into a situation where you have like this huge medical expense that you haven't planned for. But I digress. That's like a little bit more niche. So, I mean, I don't know if you have like a list off the top of your head. You mentioned a few things like childcare, like just cost of living where you are. Like, are there other kinds of expenses that you find people aren't aware of or don't account for before having a kid?
I would say like the medical bills for the birth and then and the childcare are the two biggest ones. And people just kind of generally throw around like childcare is expensive, but I always then have to say like, well, do you know what it costs where you live? Like, what are your options? What is that dollar amount? I've worked with couples that have basically decided that one parent shouldn't work anymore because that parent's salary would basically just be going towards childcare. So
which
like,
is very much a regional thing. That like it is more like childcare is more expensive in some places.
Absolutely. Yeah. Totally depends on where you live. You know, and for some people, they don't need it full time. Maybe you have a parent that can help. Maybe your job is flexible. And, you know, like for us, like Sam and I, he has a very non-traditional schedule. He's an air traffic controller. If we had a child, realistically, we wouldn't need 40 hours of childcare a week because the overlap when we're both working is probably half of that. So that helps. So you just kind of have to sit down and think about the practicalities of all of that and then put a real price tag on it. And I mean, that is really my advice when it comes to all things money. You have to just kind of get comfortable being uncomfortable. We don't like looking at the numbers. We don't like thinking about the specifics, but that's the only way to really make a plan and to feel like you are in control is to know what those numbers are.
Yeah, I tell people this about like birth and like birth complications and pregnancy complications all the time that like people, I love this quote that like worry is the work of pregnant women or pregnant people, that like you just have to be uncomfortable. Like you just have to like go through the like, oh my God, what is the worst case scenario? Because if you try to like push that down and pretend it doesn't exist, that shit comes back up, right? And like in spending, I imagine it probably comes back up in like just blind, you know, wasting money on things that aren't your priorities, things like that.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. The best way to waste money is to not think about how you're spending it. And it's funny how many people I've sat down with, you know, for a first meeting and said, what are your financial goals? And 9 times out of 10, one of the goals on the list is I want to get to a place where I don't have to think about money anymore. And I have to tell them like, I'm so sorry. That's not a real place for anybody. You know, if you have more money, maybe the choices aren't as significant because you have more money to play with, right? Like Warren Buffett's decision has more options when it comes to how much he's going to spend a month on his housing, for example. But he's still making a choice about how much money he's going to spend on his housing.
Right. I'm sure he has to spend lots of time thinking about how to spend all of his money.
He has more choices to make. And I'm not saying I feel sorry for him. Certainly he's in a great position, but there really just isn't a place where you don't think about it anymore. You always have to think about it. You always have to make choices. So
I know that resonates for me for sure, right? That as a business owner, I've like started to reach this point of like, oh, hey, it's, you know, like everyone has this imaginary number of like, oh, well, if I made this much, then I wouldn't worry anymore. And I say the same shit about like weight loss or financial goals. It's like the way that you get there is the way that you be there. So like you can be like, oh, if I got there, I would stop worrying. It's like, if you worry the whole way there, you are still going to be worried when you're there. And if you like step back, and I guess in the case of money, which I hadn't like drawn this parallel, but can say like, I want to be really aware and like, I'm using yoga terms, like present with my with my money choices, that like then you can be in that like grounded present place at every dollar amount. Am I
Mhm.
like,
Yeah,
yeah?
for sure. 100%. If you've always spent more than you make because you don't really know what you spend, and in some cases you don't really know what you make, that's a big one too. I've sat down with people and said, okay, first question, what's your salary? And they're not sure, you know? Um, that's sort of like, well, how do you know what your life can look like if you don't
Right.
even know how much money comes in every month? It's like, well, of course you're surprised that you're not making ends meet. Like you don't even know how much is coming in. And I don't say that to shame anybody. Like these are topics that our culture is very uncomfortable with, that for the most part we don't discuss at home, at school, at
Mhm.
work. So in a lot of ways, we're conditioned to behave this way.
Right. I mean, many of us did not know growing up what our parents made.
Right. Yeah.
Like that
In
is just, it's
fact,
taboo.
yeah, I remember asking my mom and having her say, like, that's none of your business. And I wasn't asking for any, sneaky reason. It's not like I was gonna go like tell all my friends, or
Mhm.
I just was curious. I thought,
Mhm.
I actually don't know the answer to that. Um, so that you just kind of like infer from other things like where your family is
Yeah.
socioeconomically.
And
But
there's like magical numbers that people get obsessed about with that, right? That it's like, oh, well, if you make six figures, like that is a certain milestone, or like
mhm,
that there is like a meaning to being like a millionaire, that
mhm,
like that is associated with some status. It's
mhm.
it's interesting to think like most of us don't actually know what any of those things mean. Like, I mean, we're like the 1% are people who are making like $400,000 or something, and most
Yeah.
of us are like, oh, like I thought it was only people with private jets. Like,
Right. Yeah. Um, yeah, no, not necessarily. It's just that there's so few people making that much money. Um, yeah, it's crazy. Really, there's so many parallels, I think, to money and to what you do. Like I was looking at your story this weekend, and um, you were talking about kind of this idea that when you become a parent, you have to give up all this other stuff. And it's like,
mm,
well, if you don't want to, then don't, right?
yeah,
It's all about how you
right.
think about it. And mindset is 100% key for finance as well.
Yeah.
If you hold on to the limiting belief that you are not good with money,
Mm,
then you never will be,
right.
right?
Because you're
And
going to continue to not look at it.
yeah, you've resolved yourself to the fact that like this is just something that you can't do, so you won't.
Right.
And so that's kind of the biggest hurdle in getting people started in whatever part of their lives, is getting them to believe that they can do this.
So if someone is currently, we're going to just like assume they haven't already had kids because they're just
Yeah.
screwed. No, I'm kidding.
No.
If someone is on the planning end of this and they're either like planning to conceive or currently pregnant,
Mhm,
and they're thinking like, "Ugh, I'm like super uncomfortable talking about money, but like I understand that there are going to be financial implications in my immediate future,"
mhm,
and they have a partner who they share
mhm,
finances with. How does someone like start that conversation? How do like, I mean, obviously, there's going to be like individual variation. Like, if it was me, I would come with a PowerPoint and be like, "So I've done the research, and in our local area, childcare costs da 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 da." However, like
yeah,
my husband and I have a very open
mhm,
like dialogue about money, where like we've many times done the calculation of like, well, like right now I work Sunday to Thursday and take Fridays off because that's one less day of childcare. And, that's something that we constantly are looking at the dollars of. But
mhm,
for someone who's not as comfortable talking about money with their partner,
yeah,
maybe like the two partners don't even necessarily know a dollar amount that they make or
mm,
that they spend. How do people do that? Like, how do you start?
yeah, it's definitely difficult. And I would say before you approach your partner to have a conversation, you should do like a self audit, right? So sit down and look at the numbers. What do I make? What are my bills and expenses? see if you can come up with a budget for yourself first, whether or not you stick to it, right? But like, just kind of figure out like, okay, this is how much is coming in every month. This is how much is going out and where. And just kind of get a holistic look of your situation. What debt do you have? What savings or investments do you have? Once you've got that, then that's one, a conversation starter. And when you're going to your partner and saying like, we need to do this, you can also say like, and I have done this for myself. It gives you some credibility because you've already done the hard thing of looking at your own stuff. And then I think the best way to approach it is to say, especially if the plan is that you're going to become parents, we're talking about having a baby. That's a big financial decision. Be vulnerable, right? I'm stressed about that. I'm worried about it. I want to feel like we're in control. How can we work together to come up with a plan to tackle this? And then you can say like, I've done all this work. It's hard sometimes as a couple to open up about money. But if you are willing to be the vulnerable party and say, these are all of my numbers. I sat down, I put this together. It was really hard and scary. And I feel like I'm failing because most people just feel like they, should have started sooner or should be doing more. Everybody feels that way. The person $100,000 in debt, the person with $100,000 in a brokerage account, they all feel the same way. We're not where we're supposed to be. So just share that because it will resonate with the person you're talking to. And hopefully that opens up the lines of conversation.
And I think that that's like, I think that I really want people to hear that of like, no one feels like, I mean, maybe you do. Do you feel like you have it all together?
I would say yes and like like yes, because I know enough and I've done the work, but I definitely also have days where I look back at how I spent money in my early 20s or how much debt I took on to go to the school that I did. And I'm just like, man, I wish I could do it different. I do still have little moments of like regret that I have to work through and remind myself like, hey, you're here, you're fine. And you can't change it. So.
And just think what a millionaire you would be if you hadn't made those no, kidding.
But you do go down those roads sometimes, right? Like, and so it's very easy to fall into the like, what if, but it's also not productive. So those thoughts are never going to go away. The key is to recognize them when they come up, like see them, feel them, and then move on.
Are there any like specific milestones, right? So one of the, if you read like any beginner personal finance book, it's going to say like, have this much in savings, have like, contribute 100% of what your company will match to your 401k and like all of these different things. Do you have like anything in particular? I would think obviously you would want to be able to pay the equivalent of your like if you're not getting parental leave or, if you don't have paid parental leave, you would want to be able to cover like the equivalent of your salary for as long as you plan on being out. Do you consider that to be like in addition to someone's savings instead? Like, are there other milestones that people should think about hitting before, taking the leap into, let's just say they've saved everything they need to cover their expenses for birth and all of that. Are there other like general goals that they should meet first?
I think those milestones that we read about are great kind of guideposts. They're also all like the ideal, right? Like, yeah, you should contribute to your 401k, whatever your company will match. But if that means that you can't put anything into savings, then no, I don't think you should be doing that.
Yeah.
So I sort of like to talk about like an order of operations instead, because it's very easy to feel like, well, I should be saving and I should be investing and I have all this debt I have to pay off. And I am also like, in addition to like just generally like putting money in like, let's call it an emergency fund, like I also need a new car next year and we want to buy a house and we're having a baby. And so it starts to feel overwhelming. There's now this like 10-part to-do list of your finances that you want, and you're trying to tackle them all simultaneously. And especially if you're a person who has just started paying attention, like that's like going 0 to 60. So I like to talk about like an order of operations, meaning like, yes, those 10 things are good to do, but we're not going to do them all at the same time. We're going to ease into each of those things. So it's almost like a checklist. And I could even like give you this list if you want to make like, you know, an infographic or something we can share with listeners, because I think the visual helps. But essentially, like the number one thing is to save money if you can, right? And you'll read articles that say like you should be saving 10 to 15% of your income. And like that's a great benchmark. But if all you can do is start with 5, then start with 5, right?
I have to insert one thing because I know that we have like some side hustlers and some like,
Yeah.
self-employed folks. That's after taxes. Like you also have to save money for taxes.
Yeah, totally.
Because I know there are a lot of parents who like give up a full-time job and like do something on the side or consult or like become a 1099 employee and do not realize for the first year that like they have to pay taxes, or maybe it's like several years in that you no longer get XYZ credit or whatever. And you go like, oh shit, like you have to pay taxes. So sorry, I just wanted to add that. Pay your taxes.
Yeah,
Then
definitely pay your
save.
taxes. Yes, for sure. Pay your taxes, then save. So like if you're not saving, start. If all you can do is $1 a week, do $1 a week, you know? That's $4 a month. At the end of the year, you'll have 48 bucks you didn't have before. But you have to start somewhere. And that's honestly one thing that really derails people is they see those benchmarks and they think, well, I can't do that, so I'm not going to do anything, right? It's kind of like when you set an unrealistic workout schedule for yourself and you're like, well, I can't go every day, so I'm not going to work out at all. It's like, no, if you went twice, that's better than 0. So definitely
100%.
save if you can. The next thing I would say is tackle any consumer debt. So credit cards, personal loans. Student debt is super flexible. I know those numbers are high and they stress people out, but if you have other stuff you want to do, I wouldn't make that a number one priority, especially right now. I mean, literally your debt is at 0% interest. It's not growing.
Right. And
like,
it might get forgiven. Stop paying it.
Yeah, seriously.
At the time of this recording, we don't know yet.
Stay tuned. But yeah, that's stuff that you can tackle later that gives you flexibility for now. And I mean, some of the dollar amounts that people have borrowed are just so high. It's, if you're going to wait to start your life until that's paid off, you're going to be waiting a long time. And
yeah, I saw someone posted recently, like, how about the student loan forgiveness thing is like, if you've paid back more than you borrowed in the first place, then it should be forgiven. And like, that is mind boggling that like years into 6 figures of debt, like you will have paid more than you borrowed in the first place.
Yeah.
Which, for a lot of people, like you may take that debt to your grave. And like,
yeah, it's true. And there are better ways to kind of tackle it. And like, if you do have excess income and everything else you want to do is funded and you want to throw more money at that, like this is a great time to get ahead because it's not growing. It's not incurring interest, but it just shouldn't be a top priority. So
consumer debt, or our car loans are considered consumer debt, right?
Yes. I would say just look at your interest rate. Like a good kind of rule of thumb is that debt over 7% interest is something you want to tackle.
Fun facts.
Yeah. And the reason that we use that 7%, just so you know where that's coming from, is that that's what we estimate you could make year over year invested in the stock market. So it's like, could this money make me more money if it was invested? Or is this debt costing me more money, right? And so that 7% is the marker. So if it's like 10% interest debt, well, that debt's costing more than you would make. Yeah. So just pay the debt.
There's also like, this is something I like for anyone who's listening, who's like, why are you talking so much, Kelly? You're not the expert. I just am super interested in personal finance. But this is This is something that like I think about with debt where I'm like, you're paying to borrow money. Right. That's like essentially what you're doing is like, it's like being on one of those subscription boxes, except you don't get anything except for what you already bought. That like, you're just paying a monthly fee to like continue to have bought something in the past.
Right.
And you can decide like, for someone who's like 37 and is like, I could take the next 3 years to pay off that debt, or, and, like have this goal of not having any consumer debt before having kids. Or I can look at it as like, I know I'm going to continue to finance my past purchases for X dollars per month. And I'm 37 years old and I'm doing a calculation here of saying, like, I want to go ahead and have kids. So I think it's also a very different decision at 27 versus 37.
For sure. Yeah.
That you get to prioritize, like, is it worth X dollars per month for me to not pay this back and to instead make a different choice with my money?
Yeah, exactly.
Which is, you're smart and wonderful and you can help people figure out what their preference is, but you can't tell them what their preference is.
No. And what's right for somebody really depends. So it depends on a lot of things, your personal preference. I mean, I've had clients before where, I know that one choice is the better choice financially, but it's stressing them out. So then we're not going to do that.
Right.
It's the way
Same
that
with
you
movement.
feel and your mental health is important too. Yeah. Right.
Right.
Like,
that I'm like, I know the most effective thing for you to do is probably blah, 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 blah. But people come into it. And often, I'm sure you see this too, people come into exercise and movement, whatever you want to call it, workouts, thinking like, the more I sweat and the more painful it is, the more effective.
right.
And I'm guessing you get people in the same, they're like, the more I sweat in this financial decision, the more painful it is. Like, people have this like very Dave Ramsey idea of like, sell all your belongings and buy the cheapest car that will get you to work, like all of that. And it's like, but also like, this is your life. And like, maybe it doesn't have to like be so unpleasant.
Yeah. I mean, people will come and say, okay, I'm just not going to go on vacation again until I pay off all this debt. And like, I'll sit there and I'll do a calculation. I'll be like, well, at the rate that you can afford to pay this back, you're not going on vacation for 6 years. Does that sound good to you? No. Also, I would never make you do that. That's so unsustainable. It's like saying, I'm not going to eat another cheeseburger until I've lost 20 pounds. Like, it could take a year to do that, or it could take two, it's just not sustainable. You have to still be able to enjoy your life. And this idea that you have to kind of punish yourself, I think, comes from the fact that we have so much shame around finance and our choices. We assume the reason that we're in debt or that we're in a bad situation is because we're stupid and we should have known better. And the reality is like, no, like, we're just humans who aren't necessarily equipped with all the information that we need to make the best choices. And money is so emotional. It is so emotional.
That's what I was going to say.
Yeah. Half the stuff that we're dealing with when it comes to our finance doesn't even have anything to do with us. It's like my mom's shit or my dad's shit that I'm now carrying around. Is it okay to say shit?
I think I've dropped the F-bomb several times.
Good.
I put the explicit. No, I put the explicit on every episode.
Oh, good. Okay. But yeah, it's inherited stuff that we don't even realize that we are, dealing with. And it can work in a whole bunch of different ways and color the way that we look at money and finance. So a lot of this is
spending is like very much, it's much like screens and sex and like all of these, I'm using sex loosely, like dating apps, like whatever, like all of these like kind of artificial ways that we've created for like giving ourselves a steady stream of dopamine so we never have to like be in the ebb and flow of being a human being. Like, you can buy your way out of that. And like, once, I think like every 20 something like has this like moment of being like, oh my God, this credit card has a $10,000 limit. Like, I can just buy so much dopamine for $10,000.
For sure. Yeah. I'm just going to spend my feelings and it's going to be fine. And it's, it's like anything. It's like binge eating or, whatever. Like there's going to be a low on the other side. Like the bill's going to come and it's not going to feel great. So, but also we have to get rid of this mentality that like budgeting and making financial choices is somehow like punishment. Like, there's a lot of stuff we spend money on that we don't really need and that we don't think through and we regret it later. Like when I first started getting on, I want to clarify too that like I've been in debt. I've had lots of credit card debt. I had student debt. I still make bad choices sometimes. But when I started to kind of get my finances together, the first thing I did was I would look at my credit card statement every month and I would go through the line items and I would really register how I felt about those things. And I kind of started to realize there was one category that always made me feel bad. Like there was one category where you know, I was always like, God, why did I do that? And it was eating out because I
I
was
was
living in
about to
New York
say,
at the time.
was it booze? Because I feel like it would have been bars for me.
I mean, I guess that's part of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like the drinking, but like, I would go to a dinner with friend that was just kind of, I wasn't even necessarily like interested in the restaurant we were going to or anything. It was just like, let's get dinner. That's how you saw people and socialized. And we wouldn't even have anything special. It's not like I was having 3 courses at like a really great restaurant. It was just like, we would like share a couple small plates and a bottle of wine, and all of a sudden, $80 each for this meal.
Right.
And all I really wanted to do was see my friend. So I was like, well, how can I do this in a different way? And so sorry, I have a crying dog here. The baby
Does the dog have a name?
Yes, her name is Maybe.
Maybe.
So yeah, and so the way that I kind of got around that was to think about, okay, what is the one, I want to stop having this feeling of regret. So I'm not going to keep spending money on these things. 2, the thing I actually want is to spend time with my friends. So I'm going to come up with some alternatives because I'm in this habit of saying like, let's get dinner. And so instead of that, what are 3 other things I can say instead? So I started to say like, let's go for a run in the park, or let's meet at my apartment for wine that I've bought that was $10 instead of $60 for the bottle, right? And it was great. And I wasn't really losing anything, but I was cutting back on something that I didn't really care about, instead of just having this stress every month of like, oh my God, how do I pay this bill?
So this is going to be a weird transition, but like it feels reminiscent to me of a lot of the decisions that largely female partners find themselves making about going back to work or staying home. And this is like definitely something like I am working on my own judgments and preconceptions about. So like I will offer that bias to the listeners up front that like, frankly, I think it's kind of ridiculous that we don't question like, oh, is this male partner going back to work? Or like will they? As if like that's even a question.
Right.
And I think that on either side of that coin, there is often regret. And I guess I'm kind of wondering, like, essentially choosing to work or not work is like one very, very large spending decision. It's also a spending decision wrapped up in a lot of other stuff, but like you're ultimately saying, like, I choose to spend my time in this way and to have more money to spend on childcare and other things, or to say, I choose to have less money. It's the equivalent of spending, have less money in order to have the result of being at home with my kid. Is like, I don't know if it's like a journal prompt or like questions, like how do people get at like, what is my preference versus what I feel like everyone else is telling me is the right thing to do?
I mean, that's a big question.
Yeah, right. Were you prepared with that?
Well, I mean, and just to go back, we touched at the beginning, I mentioned that I've had clients who've decided that one partner should stay home because they're basically just working to pay for childcare. So, do I want to work and pay another person to stay home with my kid when that's all that's happening? It's not adding any other funds to the household. But there is a cost to that, right? Like, I don't have a statistic off the top of my
It's
head.
in Lean In. If anyone wants to read Lean In, the exact statistic of like lifetime reduction in earnings is in there.
Yes. I want to say it's like $1 million
It's
or
a lot of money. I
something.
know
It's a
that.
lot. Over the course of a lifetime that someone gives up by taking off like a year of work, basically, or 2 years. Maybe it's just like, oh, I'm not going to stop working forever. I know I want to work, but I want to get my kid through to kindergarten because that's
Yeah, I
free.
think for a lot of people who have careers like, I don't know, nurses come to mind, like careers that are more like vocations where it's like you're always going to be able to get a job.
Mm-hmm.
There's no like, I know for me, if I had been working in marketing at like a certain seniority level, it would have felt very weird to be like, oh, I'm just going to leave my job for 5 years and then I'm going to come back in at like, at what seniority, right? Like probably at
Right.
a pretty significant pay cut. And then it's hard to find a job
Mm-hmm.
because you're
Yeah.
overqualified, but not really. Anyway, it feels like in certain teachers, nurses, like certain fields that like the jobs are the jobs. There's not a huge variation in like the amount of time you spend in the job. People are much more liable to just be like, oh, I'm just going to take 5 years off until my
Mm-hmm.
kids are in kindergarten.
Right.
And then 5 becomes 7 or 9 because you have more than one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like ones where there's not really a ladder. You're just kind of
Yeah,
doing this thing
right.
forever. Yeah, for sure. I would say that. Like when there is a ladder, you're kind of like spending less time on a rung, or even like you're getting off the ladder and then you've got to start climbing again when you
Mm-hmm.
come back from having a kid. So that's tough. I think when you're making those decisions though, society has one way of looking at things, and people don't ask, is is a man going to go back to work after having a kid? But you can have those conversations in your relationship if that's something that you think should be happening. I know for us, we've talked about it before, and when we talk about things like paternity leave, we talk about what that total paternity leave is, right? I get time off, but he does too,
Mm-hmm.
and I expect him to take it.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're making choices about what you want to do for a job and where you want to work, I mean, don't underestimate or count out like a job change in
Mm-hmm.
advance of becoming a parent. If the place you're working is not going to support the lifestyle that you
Mm-hmm.
want, then you can find something else. And cultures are changing, company cultures are changing. They're shifting slowly, but they are changing. So if the company you're working for is not supporting that kind of lifestyle that you want, then perhaps it's time to look at those kinds of things that maybe you weren't thinking about when you were 27 and
Right.
you just wanted the next
and
job or pay
and
bump.
some people do choose ultimately to take a to take a pay cut in advance of having a kid because because lifelong the sustainability of that
Mm-hmm.
position is greater. Or I mean, I definitely know that there are people like me who choose to say like, in the field I work in now, I get much more personal satisfaction. So, like, money aside, even if it was net zero, I would feel
Mm-hmm.
much more compelled to work in this field than I would have in previous roles, where
Yeah.
it's like you could just choose to, like, maybe take a pay cut, maybe make zero, like, net income, but go back to work in something that is more fulfilling. that
Mm-hmm.
that's like you were talking about, the time
Yeah.
versus money, like your lifestyle and your, the satisfaction that you get out of your job is part of it too.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I can tell you, I've taken a pay cut in my lifetime for like my own sake, for my happiness, well-being, and I don't have a human child. So
Child.
I have a kitty child and a puppy child, but I don't have a human child. But I
Just
made
the
that choice,
alien.
the alien. But I made that choice because I wasn't happy with what my life looked like at the
Mhm.
time. And so I figured out like, what do I need to make? I found that point at which the two things meet. What do I need to make to live the life I want to live? And then also, what are the other things that I want, right? And that's something you should be thinking about anytime, but is especially important when you start to think about the prospect of becoming a parent. But things like, what does the parental leave policy at my company look like? Do they allow for flexible work schedules? That's all stuff that, one, you can negotiate when you're hired, and two, you should be thinking about, because that adds to your overall experience as an employee there and is important for your own
and you
sanity.
teach negotiation. I'm actually glad I didn't think to like send you that in the notes ahead of time, but I'm actually glad that you mentioned it, because it did, like, so often with so many like as a business owner, I am like 9 times out of 10, if someone is like, hey, I have X, Y, and Z circumstances, are you willing to make an exception to your policies and allow me whatever? I almost always say yes, because I'm like, good for you. Good for you for asking what you needed. And like, I believe that that is something that we should all be better at. So like, I would rather positively reinforce it. And I think in general, especially when it comes to money, we're all a little reticent to like ask for what we want, whether it's a refund to a purchase we didn't mean to make, or a discount on something that we've been a loyal customer of for a long time. Like all of those things we just don't ask, and that also plays into negotiating for more money or more benefits up front, right? So if people are doing that, the math of the
we call
cost
it
of
like
having a kid, insurance plays into that, and you could get a better insurance policy potentially.
Yeah, absolutely. We call that like total compensation, like at least when we're talking about a job, right? It's like, okay, there's the salary component of what you're getting, and then there's all this other stuff that you're being offered that people don't pay a lot of attention to. But, like, is your insurance policy going to be covered by your employer? If not, how much is covered? And then also, what are the providers that they're offering? Things like paid time off, parental leave policies. You can negotiate bonuses. You can negotiate 401k contributions. I mean, you're not necessarily going to get what you want, but you can always ask for these things. And I think we're really worried that if we ask, that somehow people will think less of us, right?
That we're going to like have the offer rescinded. That it's going to be like, here's an offer for X. And we're going to be like, but could I have Y? And they'll be like, never mind.
Right.
You get nothing.
Totally. It's like they think they're going to have the offer rescinded because they're asking like, oh, this person is a pain in the ass. I don't want to offer this to them anymore. And the truth is, like, at the point at which you're getting a job offer, the company has already invested so much time in finding you as a candidate. They want this to work. Also, nowadays, they expect you to negotiate. At my current employer, I negotiated my salary and I was told that, they couldn't change it. And I said, well, what about a signing bonus? And it was hilarious to me because it was like they knew the question was coming. It took all of 3 seconds for this recruiter to confirm that, yes, I could have a signing bonus and more stock. And I was like, oh my gosh, okay, great. But, there's also the chance that I wouldn't have asked for that. And it was like, we talk about leaving stuff on the table. It was practically sitting on a table waiting. Yes. Like they were like, and then she'll say this and it will be here and we'll slide it over. It was just like so funny to me that it was so speedy.
I often will tell people the story of like my first like real job, first full-time job. I got 2 raises. I think it was 2 raises in 3.5, 4 years. I did not ask for any of them. I was not even told they were coming. Like literally, I just got my pay stub and was like, oh, and it was direct deposit. So like it had just appeared in my bank. Like there was one point where I literally like looked at my bank account and was like, that's weird. Like, was it like one of those like off weeks where there was like, I'd already paid my, and I was just like, no, like they literally just gave me a 10% raise, like something crazy like that. And I'm like, what if I'd asked? That's what I got for not asking.
Yeah, right. Like and that's great because not all companies will do that.
Right.
So it's awesome that you got something.
I hope that that's the same amount I would have gotten if I had asked, that they were just like, this is what Kelly's work is worth. And what my work is worth, not what I am worth.
Not what Kelly's worth.
But like, this is what Kelly contributes to the company. We're just going to pay her that. Or, for other people who are at the same level of seniority, like we've just increased everyone's pay by this much. Like, I hope that's how they did it. But I've always wondered, what could I have gotten if I had actually asked?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've been in situations like that too. I remember, companies won't always be transparent about like the process for getting raises or for compensation conversations. And I asked so many questions about this one company that I worked for. And I remember one day I was on the phone with a customer and I was talking to them, and somebody came over to my desk and was like, hey, like they were waving me over. And I was like, what? Like I was clearly on the phone with somebody, and they said, oh, they need you in the conference room. And I said, well, tell them I'll be there in 10 minutes. I'm on the phone with somebody. So I finished my call. I go into this conference room, and they literally handed me a piece of paper, and they were like, this is your annual review, and this is what you make now. And I was like, I'm sorry, what's happening? It wasn't even like a scheduled conversation. They just came over and like tapped me on the shoulder and were like, here you go. And the worst part is that the attitude was like, you should be grateful, right? There was this presumption that like I should be so grateful that they were giving me, my like 3 or 4% raise, whatever it was. And I wasn't. I was totally blindsided. I had asked many questions about this process. I had taken on a lot more responsibility in the last year. And so that's the other thing you have to remember is like the way that people treat you is not necessarily going to feel good, or and they might ascribe to those old school like mentalities of like, you should be grateful and you should not be asking for too many things. But that doesn't mean that you have to live that way or accept that or comport
It's also
yourself
a
that
really
way.
good indication of like values, right? That there are companies who will say, we really value having a diverse workforce. But what actually happens is that they don't have flexible work policies. They don't have allowances for parental leave. They don't have, sick day, like personal days that you can take if your kid gets sick. It's like, okay, you can say that you value having a diverse workforce, but like clearly you don't.
Right.
And so if you do feel like there is not an alignment in values here, you get to make a different choice. And the same is true in your workplace as it is in your home life, right? That you can be like, I don't value, like you can be like, I don't see myself as materialistic, and yet I'm shopping my feelings so that I don't have to feel them. And you can like look at your credit card statement and be like, this does not reflect my values of, in my case, like being like a hippie earth hugger, like, that I have like subscribed to those like meal kits, and I'm like, the food is yummy. This does not align with my values.
Yeah.
Like there are a lot of plastic bags.
There's so much packaging. Yeah. Totally.
So you can like look at that, and I think people are afraid of like feeling hypocritical, right? The same thing goes with like talking to your partner about these things, right? Of like, you don't want to come to the table and be like, hey, you need to reduce your spending on XYZ because that your spending isn't aligned with your family's values either. And like, that's uncomfortable.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good point, is like really sitting down and knowing what you value and remembering that like any choice you make with your money is a choice, right? You don't have to own a house ever in your life if you don't want to. You don't have to have a $40,000 wedding if you don't want to. You don't have to have children. You don't have to travel. Those are things that you're choosing to do or that you want to do, and there's nothing wrong with any of them. And you can plan for them, but you have to get out of the mindset of like, well, I have to do this, because no, you don't. You don't have to drive an expensive car or get a new one every 5 years, just because other people are doing this, or, I say this only to say that the language that people use to talk about these kinds of things impacts the way that they think about them. And I
Yes.
have people say that to me all the time. Well, I have to invite every member of my family to this get together. And I have to pick up the bill when I go out to dinner with my sister. And it's, maybe you feel that you should, but that's very different than
I
have
want
to.
to, right? And I literally
Yes.
I'm like nodding along because I literally just taught this last night, not with money, but with time
Yeah.
in my postpartum program, that many people will say, I have to breastfeed,
Mm.
or I have to wash the dishes. I have to clean the house. I have to have things done in a particular way. And what you mean is, I am uncomfortable with the consequences if I do not do this.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just a preference, right? Like I said, you should pay your taxes first. You don't have to. Like, you don't have to pay your taxes. You're just taking a gamble on like the potential consequences. And like
Right.
that, it, as much as like it feels like a little bit ridiculous to be like, this is semantics and it doesn't matter. And like we both studied communication. So like I like that we're like now into the words of like, but it does matter. You can sit there and say, I want to pay my taxes because I like having functioning roads and public schools and I want to not go to jail. Like, and that feels very different from like, oh, I have to pay my taxes, or, and it's also okay for people to have different values, right? My husband insists on driving our 2013 Honda Fit. It is like an eyesore. But the thing has like 30,000 miles on it.
Oh, that's awesome.
Because we had it in New York and then we left the country for a year and a half. So like, he's just like, this is a functioning vehicle and I don't need a new one. And like, I don't care how it looks. And that's like a choice that he can make. And I can be like, I would like a new car.
Yeah.
And like, we get to make that decision together and he doesn't have to value it, right? That in a relationship, your partner may disagree about the value of you finding fulfillment at work. And they may not see the monetary dollars and cents benefit of you continuing to work because it doesn't bring home a whole lot of extra cash. And that's like, you might need to see a couples therapist because that's like some pretty deep shit of like you being like, I want to, feel fulfilled in my work and that's more important than taking care of our kids. And they may disagree. And like, that's like a pretty root issue that you hopefully know about before having kids. But it is like at some point you are two independent humans who like each have your own set of values and like, that's okay.
Absolutely. So, and I would just add, that was the one thing I wanted to add in terms of finances, like as a couple, when you start to have these conversations is, keep in mind too, that you're not going to agree on everything. So it's good for you to have some values and goals that are aligned. If becoming a parent is something you both want, that's something you can work towards together. There's also going to be places where you don't overlap. We, for example, it's kind of the opposite of your situation, Kelly. Sam just like always wants to have a nice car, and I could care less about cars. I just don't enjoy spending money on them. So he has a high car payment, and that's fine. That's his thing that he gets to do. That, obviously it's still in the budget, but that's maybe something that I wouldn't have chosen to do.
Right.
And that's okay. You have to each have some space to disagree financially.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I would not feel compelled to own a house. It was important to him. And so we own a house because like we were going to pay rent anyway. Like I also think that there's room to say like he would drive something. Like
yeah, you're not suggesting he just get a scooter. Yeah.
So let's wrap up here. Tell people if they want to get some support, like if they're like, Lindsay's so kind and like I want to feel nice about my money, how can people get support in making financial decisions?
Yeah. So if anyone wants to work with me, they can just reach out to me on Instagram. My handle is at the Lindsay Perez.
Lindsay with an A.
Lindsay with an A, the right way. Just kidding. And then some other resources I was going to share. I was just going to note, there's a lot of information online. When you Google anything, there's 1,000 things that come up. And so just kind of one thing I like to give to people is that 2 websites I think are always reliable and well researched are NerdWallet. I absolutely love them. They have a ton of calculators and resources that are really helpful. And then Bankrate is also a really great educational site.
And I should know this off the top of my head. He's going to hear this my husband used to work for one of those. He worked for the parent company, and so he did PR for like all of the brands. Okay. And I don't remember which ones are competitors and which ones are their brands. I don't think NerdWallet was one of their brands. I think that's a competitor, but I don't know if Bankrate was. But okay. They are good. They all are wonderful calculators and good educational resources. Amazing. Mm-hmm. Okay. Anything else you want people to know?
I don't know. I feel like I've given my big takeaways.
Yes.
So I would just say, when it comes to anything money-wise, you absolutely can. The big question is, will you?
So good. All right. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for sharing all of this goodness.
Thank you. I'm so excited we got to chat.